thousands of passengers look out their windows every single day and see the snow-capped peaks of the European Alps passing beneath them. It's one of the most breathtaking views in commercial aviation, and almost every single one of those passengers has the exact same thought. I wish we were flying lower so I could see those mountains properly. But if you ask any experienced pilot, they'll tell you something that might surprise you. Flying low over the Alps isn't just difficult. It's one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do in a commercial aircraft. And the reasons have almost nothing to do with the mountains themselves. Before I explain why the Alps are essentially a no-go zone for low-altitude flying, if you love uncovering the hidden secrets of aviation, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because what I'm about to tell you will completely change the way you look at mountain ranges from your window seat. Alright, let's get into it. When we fly over mountain ranges, our natural instinct is to want to get closer. The peaks look majestic, the glaciers look stunning, and we feel like we're missing out on the best views by being stuck at 35,000 feet. But here's the uncomfortable truth that most passengers never realize. At cruising altitude, you are safe. At low altitude over mountains, you are in a completely different environment where the rules of physics change dramatically. And the first rule that changes is something called the coffin corner. Now that sounds dramatic, and that's because it is. The coffin corner is a specific point in aviation where the speed of the aircraft gets dangerously close to two limits at the exact same time. On one side you have the stall speed. That's the minimum speed the plane needs to stay in the air. On the other side, you have the critical Mach speed. That's the maximum speed the plane can handle before the airflow over the wings becomes supersonic and causes catastrophic control issues. In normal flight at high altitude, there's plenty of room between these two limits. But at low altitude over mountains, that room shrinks to almost nothing. And the reason is air density. Down near mountain peaks, the air is thicker than it is at cruising altitude. Thicker air means more drag on the aircraft. More drag means the engines have to work harder to maintain speed. But the real danger isn't drag. The real danger is that mountain ranges create their own weather systems, and those weather systems are absolutely brutal. Here's a scenario that every alpine pilot dreads. A plane is flying through a valley at a relatively low altitude. The wind suddenly shifts direction and hits the mountain face directly. That wind is forced upward at an incredible speed, forming what's called a mountain wave. Mountain waves can lift an aircraft hundreds of feet in seconds without the pilot touching the controls. That sounds helpful, but it's actually terrifying because what goes up must come down. On the other side of the mountain wave, the air plunges downward just as violently, creating a downdraft that can slam a plane toward the ground faster than the engines can compensate. In extreme cases, these downdrafts can exceed 3,000 feet per minute. That's 50 feet per second. In a valley surrounded by peaks that are 12,000 feet tall, 50 feet per second is a death sentence if the pilot isn't prepared. But it gets worse. These same mountain waves often create something called rotors. Rotors are like horizontal tornadoes that form on the leeward side of mountains. They're invisible, completely unpredictable. And they can cause severe turbulence that throws passengers against the ceiling and makes flight controls nearly unresponsive. Even the most advanced weather radar struggles to detect rotors because they don't contain moisture. They're just swirling masses of chaotic air. So a pilot flying low over the Alps isn't just navigating mountains. They're navigating invisible obstacles that can appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what about helicopters? They fly low over the Alps all the time. And you're right. Rescue helicopters, sightseeing helicopters, they do fly low. But they're operating under completely different rules. A helicopter can hover, it can change direction instantly, it can land in a field if things go wrong. A commercial airliner cannot. A commercial airliner at low altitude over mountains is committed. It cannot stop, it cannot turn on a dime, and it certainly cannot land on a glacier. If an engine fails at low altitude over the Alps, the pilot has seconds to make a decision, not minutes. And the harsh reality is that there are very few flat places to put a plane down in the middle of the European mountain range. But there's another reason that's even more subtle and even more dangerous. Mountain ranges interfere with radio signals. The peaks block line of sight communication between the aircraft and ground control. So a pilot flying through a deep valley might suddenly lose contact with air traffic control at the exact moment they need guidance the most. This is why standard operating procedures for alpine flights require strict adherence to predefined corridors. Pilots don't just fly wherever they want over the Alps. They follow specific routes that keep them above a minimum safe altitude known as the EMSA. The EMSA guarantees that even in the worst weather conditions, the aircraft will clear the highest peak in that sector by at least 2,000 feet. On a clear day, 2,000 feet might not seem like much, but when you consider that some alpine peaks exceed 15,000 feet, that means the plane is still flying at nearly 18,000 feet over the mountains. That's significantly lower than cruising altitude, but it's still high enough to avoid the worst rotor activity and mountain wave turbulence. Now let's talk about icing, because this is where the Alps become truly terrifying. The Alps are one of the most moisture-rich mountain ranges in the world. Clouds form constantly around the peaks, and those clouds contain supercooled water droplets. These are droplets that remain liquid even below freezing because they don't have a particle to freeze onto. When an aircraft flies through a cloud of supercooled droplets, those droplets instantly freeze onto the wings, the nose, the tail, and the engine inlets. And this isn't slow ice buildup like you see on a car windshield. This is rapid structural icing that can change the shape of the wing in minutes. The ice disrupts the airflow, reduces lift, increases drag, and adds significant weight. At high altitude, pilots can usually descend to warmer air to melt the ice off. But over the Alps, descending isn't an option because the ground is too close. So a pilot flying low over the mountains is essentially trapped between the ice above them and the peaks below them. Fun fact, modern de-icing systems on aircraft are incredibly effective at preventing ice buildup, but they have limits. The boots on the leading edge of the wing can only expand and contract so many times before they lose effectiveness. The heated engine inlets can only handle so much ice ingestion before the system becomes overwhelmed. And when those limits are reached, the pilot has no choice but to climb to a higher altitude where the air is drier and the ice risk is lower. But climbing over the Alps means climbing into the flight paths of other aircraft that are following the same safety corridors. And that creates another problem entirely. Traffic density. The Alps sit right in the middle of Europe. This is one of the busiest airspaces on the planet. Every day, thousands of flights cross the mountain range from every direction. To keep these flights safe, air traffic control divides the airspace into specific lanes, much like a highway system. Each lane has a specific direction, a specific altitude, and a specific speed limit. If a single aircraft deviates from its assigned lane to avoid weather or ice, it can disrupt the entire system. In worst-case scenarios, it can cause a loss of separation between aircraft, which means they get too close to each other. This is why the decision to fly low over the Alps isn't really a decision at all. It's a restriction imposed by safety, physics, and human limitations. But here's the part that most people never consider. The Alps aren't just dangerous for the aircraft, they're dangerous for the passengers too. At low altitude, the cabin pressure system works differently because the outside air pressure is higher. That means the pressure difference between the cabin and the outside is smaller, and the emergency oxygen masks deploy differently. In the event of a rapid depressurization at low altitude over mountains, the pilots have less time to descend to a breathable altitude because they're already relatively low. But descending further puts them at risk of terrain collision. So in a depressurization scenario, the pilots have to make an impossible choice: descend into the mountains and risk hitting a peak, or stay at altitude and risk hypoxia for the passengers. It's a lose-lose situation, which is exactly why standard operating procedures require pilots to carry enough extra fuel to divert around the Alps entirely if weather conditions are marginal. Fun fact number 2. The famous Flight 123 over the Alps in the 1990s wasn't brought down by the mountains themselves, but by the weather patterns they created. A microburst formed over a valley caused by a sudden temperature drop in the upper atmosphere. The microburst pushed the aircraft downward with such force that the pilots couldn't recover, even with full power. That incident changed how airlines plan routes over mountain ranges forever. Today, every flight path over the Alps is pre-approved by aviation authorities weeks in advance, based on weather forecasts and seasonal patterns. Now, you might have noticed something interesting. We've talked about flying low, but what about flying high over the Alps? Why don't pilots just fly at 50,000 feet and completely avoid all of these problems? Well, the answer is depressingly practical. Commercial aircraft aren't certified to fly that high. The cabin pressurization systems, the engine performance, and the passenger oxygen systems are all designed for a maximum operating altitude of about 43,000 feet. Above that, the air is too thin for the engines to produce sufficient thrust. And the cabin would struggle to maintain a safe pressure for the passengers. So pilots are stuck in that narrow band between the mountains and the limit of their aircraft's capabilities. And that band is exactly where the worst weather lives. But there's one more reason pilots don't fly low over the Alps that has nothing to do with safety, physics, or weather. And that reason is noise pollution. The Alps are home to millions of people in towns and villages nestled in the valleys. Those people have lived there for generations, and they value their peace and quiet. Low-flying aircraft create a massive noise footprint that can disrupt wildlife, disturb sleep, and lower property values. Over the years, local governments have imposed strict noise abatement procedures that restrict flights to certain altitudes and certain hours of the day. So even if a pilot wanted to fly low for a better view, they would be violating local laws and facing heavy fines for the airline. In fact, some alpine regions have banned all commercial traffic below a certain altitude except for emergencies. And helicopters are subject to even stricter rules because their noise is more intrusive at ground level. So the next time you're flying over the Alps and you look out the window at those magnificent peaks, and you wish you were lower, remember this. At 35,000 feet, you are breathing pressurized air, you are outside the rotor zone. You are above the worst of the mountain wave turbulence, you are clear of the structural icing layer, you are inside reliable radio range, and you are legally compliant with local noise regulations. At low altitude, you are none of those things. The view might be better, but the margins for error are razor thin. And in aviation, razor thin margins are the difference between a smooth flight and a catastrophic accident. So when you see your flight map making a wide arc around the Alps instead of cutting straight through, don't be disappointed. Be grateful. Your pilot isn't taking the scenic route, they're taking the safe route. And that is exactly what you paid for. Fun fact number 3. The highest airport in the Alps is located in Switzerland at an elevation of just over 5,000 feet. But commercial airlines rarely use it because the approach requires flying through a narrow valley with steep cliffs on both sides. Only specially trained pilots and specially modified aircraft are allowed to operate there. It's a reminder that even with all our technology, mountains still command respect. If this video changed the way you think about mountain flying, subscribe to the channel for more aviation secrets and drop a like. And let me know in the comments, have you ever flown over the Alps and wondered why the route felt so wide? I'd love to hear your stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one where we'll uncover another hidden truth about the skies above us.